the silent woods. The locals called it the Silent Woods. It was an innocuous name, enough to pique the interest of out-of-towners and hikers looking for a thrill. But anyone who'd grown up near the forest's edge knew better than to venture inside. The silence, they said, was unnatural, deep and impenetrable, as though sound itself was devoured the moment you crossed its invisible line. Anna had grown up on the stories, tales of people who had wandered in and never come out, and of strange, shadowy figures that occasionally appeared in the fog along the treeline. But she dismissed it all as folklore, wild imaginings concocted to scare kids into behaving. However, her perspective shifted one early autumn when her brother, Jamie, ventured into those woods and never came out. The police found no trace of him, no footprints, no sign of struggle, nothing. It was as if he'd simply vanished. Anna was devastated, but grief gave way to a single-minded determination to uncover the truth. The woods were said to be vast, with no end, no clear trails, and so dense that even the sun struggled to filter through its towering trees. No one was willing to go back in and search for Jamie, and Anna's parents pleaded with her to let it go. But she couldn't. 1 year later, armed with supplies, a sturdy backpack, and a lantern, Anna made her way to the edge of the silent woods. The first thing she noticed was the absence of sound. It was more than quiet. It was a stillness so profound that her own footsteps seemed muted, swallowed by the trees. Even the usual sounds of insects or the rustle of leaves were non-existent. She felt like she was sinking into a void. Anna glanced over her shoulder, half expecting to see her world left behind like an image in a mirror. The trees seemed to close in, their branches forming a canopy that darkened the path in front of her. She took a deep breath, pushing down the fear that crawled up her spine, and moved forward. Hours passed, though it felt like days. She'd stopped checking her watch, knowing that time held no meaning here. The deeper she ventured, the thicker the fog became, swirling around her feet and chilling her bones. Every few steps, she'd pause, straining to hear something, anything, but there was only the suffocating silence. Anna stumbled across the occasional marker, an old shoe, a torn scarf, things that must have belonged to others who had wandered into the woods. She stuffed down the sick feeling in her stomach and pressed on. The fog grew denser, until she could barely see her hand in front of her face. She used her lantern to cut through the mist, revealing more of the twisted branches and shadowy trunks around her. Then she saw it, a figure, standing just beyond the reach of her light. Her heart pounded as she strained to make out any details, but the figure was shrouded in fog, only the vaguest outline visible. She blinked, and it was gone. She backed up, her hand gripping the lantern tightly as she scanned the trees. The silence was almost mocking, a taunting reminder that she was utterly alone. Or so she thought. As night fell, Anna found herself deeper in the woods than she'd planned. She'd lost track of her direction, but she pressed on, her legs aching and her resolve fraying. She stopped for a moment, trying to remember how long she'd been walking. It felt endless, as if the forest had wrapped around her in loops, ensuring that every step only pulled her further into its heart. Suddenly, she saw a light in the distance, a dim, flickering glow that cast shadows on the mist. She approached cautiously, hoping for signs of another person. The closer she got, the more she could make out the outline of a cabin nestled between trees, its roof sagging under layers of moss. It seemed impossible that anyone could live here. Anna called out, but her voice felt small, muted. She tried again, louder this time, but the silence swallowed her words. Steeling herself, she moved toward the door, knocking twice. No answer. When she tried the handle, the door creaked open, revealing an empty interior shrouded in shadow. The room was sparse, a table with a single chair, an old lamp, and walls covered in strange symbols. On the table lay an old journal, its leather cover cracked and worn. She picked it up, flipping to the last entry. The writing was hurried, erratic, as if written by someone in a frenzy. There is no escape. They come in the silence, watching, waiting. I hear their whispers in my mind, even when I cover my ears. They are the keepers of the woods, and they do not let the living leave. I write this in the hope that someone finds it, though I know it is useless. If you read this, it's already too late for you. The entry ended abruptly, the ink smeared as though the writer's hand had been seized mid-sentence. Anna's hands shook as she read, the fear settling into her bones. She glanced around, half expecting to see someone or something lurking in the shadows. The cabin was stifling, filled with an oppressive sense of dread that pushed her back outside. She stumbled into the fog, gasping for air, but as soon as she stepped beyond the threshold, she froze. Standing a few feet away was the figure from before, a tall silhouette cloaked in darkness, its face obscured by a hood. She took a step back, her lantern flickering as if responding to the figure's presence. And then, without a sound, it lifted its arm, pointing deeper into the woods. Every instinct told her to run, but some part of her was compelled to follow. The figure turned, gliding silently between the trees, leading her down a path she hadn't noticed before. She followed, the fog parting like a curtain as she moved. The deeper they went, the colder it grew, and soon she could see her breath hanging in the air. Her surroundings began to change. The trees twisted, their branches contorting into grotesque shapes, as if reaching for her. The silence became heavier, pressing down on her until it was almost unbearable. Finally, the figure stopped. It raised its arm, gesturing to a large, gnarled tree that stood alone in a clearing. At its base lay a scattering of bones, bleached white and tangled in the roots. The realization hit her like a punch to the gut. The bones were arranged in patterns, as if placed with deliberate care. She looked closer, horror dawning as she recognized a tattered piece of clothing caught in the roots, a shirt she'd given Jamie the last time she saw him. "No," she whispered, her voice breaking. Her brother was here, part of the forest, his remains woven into its roots. She dropped to her knees, tears streaming down her face, but her grief was cut short by a feeling of something behind her. She turned, and the figure was there, closer than before, its face finally visible. It was hollow, a mask of decay, eyes that glowed faintly in the dim light. It tilted its head, watching her with a curiosity that was almost childlike, as though fascinated by her reaction. "Why?" she asked, barely able to form the words. But there was no answer, only the silent stare. She felt a chill creep up her spine, as though icy fingers were tracing along her skin. The silence around her grew louder, a deafening void that seemed to pulse with a heartbeat of its own. And then she heard them, faint whispers, voices that grew louder with each second. She glanced down at the bones, and to her horror, they began to move, shifting and rearranging themselves. Her brother's bones and others were coming to life, twisting into grotesque forms that lurched forward, their hollow eyes fixed on her. Anna stumbled back, but the hooded figure blocked her escape, its eyes glowing brighter, feeding off her terror. She realized then that it wasn't just a guardian of these woods. It was a predator, and she was its prey. As the skeletal figures closed in, she felt the silence engulf her completely, her own scream trapped within her throat. The last thing she saw was the hooded figure reaching out, its hand a shadow that consumed everything, pulling her into the endless silence. Anna was never seen again, and the silent woods reclaimed her as it had so many others. The locals kept their distance, warning newcomers with the same stories, the same tales of people who'd wandered too far. And on quiet nights, when the wind was still, some swore they could hear whispers from the forest's edge, a faint echo of voices, lost in the silence, calling out for those who dared to listen. This story layers supernatural horror with an atmosphere that continually builds, leaving the silent woods a mystery that absorbs all who venture into it, both physically and psychologically. The quiet grows oppressive, pulling readers deep into the eerie silence and bringing the horror closer as the story unfolds.